Hi, everybody. You're watching another special election update edition of the Orchardcast. Each week of the Canadian federal election, I'll be joined by a different guest to discuss key issues and developments in the campaign. Election episodes of this podcast will be free for anyone who wants to listen, but if you like the work I do and want to hear full episodes of the regular non-election period Orchardcast, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. This week, we've got David Moscrop on the show. David is a political commentator whose work has appeared in the Globe and Mail, the Washington Post, Jacobin, Canada's National Observer, the Toronto Star, the Walrus, the Tyee, and many other places. He's also the author of the book, Too Dumb for Democracy, that's a question mark, and is the host of the appropriately titled David Moscrop Show, which you can find on YouTube as well as here on Substack, and probably in your RSS feed, I would imagine. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, and my apologies to the listeners off the top. You can maybe hear this. I'm getting over an Easter cold, and so I'm going to be fueled by hope, hard work, and Cepacol for the next hour or so.
That's right. And I wanted to ask you, David, whether you have election fever, but you've already kind of answered that.
You know what? I feel like election fatigue, because as we were talking about a little bit before we started recording, I'm here in Ontario, in Ottawa, formerly Pierre Poilievre's riding, incidentally. And I went from covering the U.S. election, because, you kind of have to in this country, to covering the Ontario election, to covering the Liberal leadership election, to covering the federal election in just several months. And it starts to eat away at you after a little while.
Yeah, I mean, even just covering this election, well, in the Liberal leadership race, we're entering the final week, and yesterday I was just like, oh my God, I am so swamped this week. Jagmeet Singh is going to be in Edmonton tomorrow to do a rally with, Heather McPherson and Blake Desjardins and Trisha Estabrooks and Rachel Notley, who
Really?
did not like Jagmeet Singh very much when she was premier. Now suddenly they're BFFs, and I hope I can ask Rachel about that.
Yeah. They're saving the furniture, right? This is the Save the Furniture play in Edmonton?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, we could end up in a situation where half of the NDP seats are in Edmonton.
Yeah.
If they can hang on in Griesbach, which is my riding, Blake Desjardins represents, and win Edmonton Centre, which, polling aggregators are suggesting is a safe Liberal seat now that they've gotten rid of the disgraced Randy Boissonneau, but Trisha Estabrooks is a strong candidate. She used to be the chair of the public school board here and was a CBC journalist before and has been campaigning for like a year and a half. So I think she'll do better than the aggregators suggest, but I don't know if she'll win. In 2021, it was a pretty close three-way race with the NDP and, not so distant third, but they were like less than 2,000 votes behind the Conservatives, who were less than 1,000 votes behind the Liberals. So that'll be interesting. And then I've got other non-election stuff that is just making my life incredibly chaotic. Like there's a hydrogen expo that happens here every year that I've committed to go to cover for at least one outlet. I was gonna do a newsletter on it also, but I found out Jagmeet's coming. I'm like, I'm gonna cover that from the newsletter instead. In the Alberta Federation of Labor has its conference this weekend, and they're having their election for president and secretary treasurer. which I'm going to go cover on Saturday. So, I mean, this is going to be a pretty intense week for me work-wise. All that said, let's do a little polling update before we get into our topics of discussion. According to CBC Poll Tracker, the Liberals have 43%. The Conservatives have 38%. The NDP has 8%. The Bloc Québécois has 6%. Greens have 2%. And the People's Party has 2%. That's, of course, rounding these numbers. The Greens are a bit ahead of the PPC, but both round out to 2%. Now, let's get to it. This week might have been a relatively slow week in terms of policy announcements from the parties. That's likely because both official debates occurred. The French one was on Wednesday and the English one on Thursday. Somewhat overshadowing the debates themselves was the prominent presence of personalities from far-right media outlets in the French post-debate, and then the outright cancellation of the English one. At the French debate, or after the French debate, I should say, more than a third of questions asked of the four major party leaders were from people representing Rebel News, True North, and then True North's sort of offshoot on Substack, Juno News. And they're precisely the type of bad faith questions you would expect. Transphobic rants, residential school denialism, Christianity is under attack, these sorts of things. While the debate commission only allows one reporter and one photographer per news outlet, at least in Rebel's case, their lawyers argued that they should be entitled to send 5 reporters because it has 5 distinct regional news divisions. So they were saying they were more like Post Media than, say, the National Post. But for some reason, Leaders Debate Commission Executive Director Michel Cormier wasn't aware that the Rebel had registered as a third-party advertiser during the election. So they are an active participant in the election and can't really be characterized as people who are just covering it. The English post-debate scrums, as I mentioned earlier, were canceled after Rebel commander Ezra Levant reportedly attempted to disrupt a CBC broadcast. He also got into a verbal altercation in the media room with Hill Times reporter Stu Benson. The cops were called, and Levant left the room with Cormier. He returned after about 10 minutes, saying that the two sides had found, in his words, common ground. Now, my question for you, David, is how is the debate commission so bad at this?
What's funny is I do moderating quite often, and I always say the same thing. When we do the Q&A at the end, because the Q&A is fun and really important, but I always say your question should fit on a Post-it note and should end in a question mark. And if it doesn't, then it's not really a question. It's a soliloquy or a rant, as you put it. And I think it's predictable that the Debates Commission could have said, we might have a problem here if we're going to allow 5 reporters from Rebel, and we're only going to do it because we quite frankly can't be arsed to deal with all their emails. Because that was the explanation, was basically, we're going to roll over rather than fight this because it's easier to roll over. And that was a major blunder, as was the fact that they scheduled the French debate on a night where it turns out the Habs had a make it or break it playoff game, and then had to move up the debate by an hour to compromise so that people could, watch the early part of the debate and then leave halfway through if they wanted to watch the Habs game, which started midway through the debate. And last minute, they kicked the Green Party out, something like a week after the Green Party had qualified for the debates, but then subsequently not run candidates in certain ridings to try to strategically block the Tories. So it was, 3 kind of screw ups in a row, and everyone in the know started asking, okay, well, what's the point of these guys? The debates consortium the commission was created to try to rationalize and professionalize the process which had previously been left to broadcasters or whomever, universities, civil society groups that could hold their own debates. And that in theory kind of makes sense. But what happens is we end up with fewer debates in this commission, and quite critically, a commission that was risk averse. And this was a critique I saw raised by a number of people, that as soon as you made this basically a state organization, because it's, falls under the aegis of the state, you make it wildly risk averse. So you start making really, really bad calls that are based in nervousness about public pressure, or are an immediate reaction to public pressure. And then you get all these cluster screw ups. And so what's the point of having this thing? We need another model has been the thing that's raised from that. So some cast this as growing pains. I think this is the third election with the commission. There's been problems in the press too. I'm not convinced it's growing pains. I think it's a structural problem with the commission itself. Oh, by the way, also, there's no definition for them of what a media organization is, really, right? And that's the other problem. And I saw some people say, look, there needs to be a definition of some sort, whether, some suggested it's the qualified media journalism organization that the government uses for tax purposes or whatever. Part of that is, do you create original media content, which, by the way, would be an interesting one to put to some of these far right groups, because as things stand, it's just
a court ruled. I don't recall which court. Was it the Supreme Court?
I don't remember if it was that or the Superior Court or the Appeals Court.
Doesn't do any original, or not that it doesn't do any original journalism. That is mostly, spin on existing reporting that is done by, qualified, media outlets. Of course, there is a problem with the government deciding who is qualified as media and who isn't, right? That these organizations will no doubt seize upon. But yeah, I guess what's the alternative? Like, obviously, the Leaders Debate Commission is not fit for purpose, but I guess I'm showing my youth and inexperience. But how did things work before that?
Well, there were different models. There was the kind of Wild West model of figure it out. There was the consortium model of the broadcasters did it, and there's problems with every model, right? Because in the sort of broadcaster consortium model, like, okay, well, what about India? Do indie outlets get shut out? Do universities get shut out? Do civil society organizations get shut out? There was a kerfuffle in 2015 over who went to which debate. One guy, I can't remember who didn't go to the foreign policy debate. It might have been Trudeau, put on by the Monk School or whatever it was.
Trudeau was there.
And so Harper maybe didn't go. I can't remember exactly what the thing was.
I do remember that debate.
Someone didn't go. But I like that, and I think we should work forward from what we want. And if it's me, first of all, I think debates are kind of goofy the way that we do them. But if we're going to do them, let's say, okay, how do we extract the most value? As well, one, try to do what the French side does, because their debates tend to be better. But two, have more of them. Why not have 3 or 4 debates that are policy specific, so that you don't have 30 seconds tacked on to the end to deal with Gaza or climate change or whatever. And of course, you need to induce the parties to actually participate, because it's tough for them. They become targets. They don't necessarily want to be targets and participate. But the current model doesn't work. I don't know what the solution is, but the Federal Debate Commission, I don't think, is the solution, in part because the reasons you mentioned, the reason I mentioned earlier, the risk aversion, and the fact that as a state entity, they are subject to these attacks and court rulings that are going to lead to this or facilitate this disruption. And I say all that with the caveat that I actually think we should allow right-wing media outlets, even ones we deeply disagree with, to be there in the same way that we should have left-wing media outlets there because I think it's very important to protect journalistic integrity and free speech. But that doesn't mean letting people there to stand up and do soliloquies when they're doing advocacy work, not journalism. And that's what we need to work out, is what's journalism and what's advocacy. And I think activism and journalism are also very, very closely bound up in a way that lefty media often holds up as a model. And I think that's good. But what's the difference between that and disruption? And that you get into a really tricky spot there. But so I don't have the answers, but I don't think the answers are to be found in the commission. That's the big takeaway.
Yeah. Now, I want to also talk about how yesterday the Liberals and New Democrats unveiled their full costed platforms. Carney is pledging $130 billion in new spending over the next 4 years, almost a quarter of which comes from cutting income taxes by 7% and canceling the capital gains tax hike. He's also committing $18 billion to increasing military spending so Canada can hit the NATO target of 2% of GDP by 2030, rather than 2032, which was the previous plan. Carney has also suggested that that number is going to grow in the coming years. In line with his commitment to increasing capital spending while reducing operational spending, Carney plans on capping public sector growth at 2% each year, compared with an average of 9% annually over the past decade. This will obviously impact services that people rely on, but Carney promises this won't impact health and social transfers to the provinces, childcare, dental care, or pharmacare, as well as a school meal program that is slowly being rolled out. The centerpiece of the NDP platform is a wealth tax of 1% on holdings ranging between $10 million and $50 million, 2% for those up to $100 million, and 3% for everything greater than that number. The party estimates that this will earn the federal government about $25 billion a year. They also plan on maintaining the capital gains tax increase that Carney is reversing. Those funds and more will be spent on expanding mental health care support, providing a rebate for electric vehicles except for Teslas, and giving funding for provinces to hire more family doctors. Now, I think perhaps the strongest contrast between the NDP and Liberal and Conservative approaches towards revenue generation and taxation is this wealth tax, which the NDP has ran on in 2019 and 2021. So one thing I'm left wondering after reading reports about the costed platforms is why the NDP waited until a week before the election to pledge its wealth tax.
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, we could see it coming a mile away. I mean, as you mentioned, they've run it before. It's no surprise. It's ideologically consistent with the party. It's possible they were waiting to try to make a big splash at the end because maybe they were going to adjust this or that based on the final platform as well. I talked to the party last week and said, when's this thing coming? When are we going to get the platforms? Because I was writing about how I was irritated that we weren't getting platforms. And they said, we're working on it. It'll be out soon. There's a lot of moving parts, especially with Trump, et cetera. And that makes sense because let's be honest. All the numbers we're seeing from all the costed platforms, that's good. We should see that. But the idea we know that we can tell with significant confidence what the deficit's going to be 4 years from now is bananas. I don't think any of the numbers we see right now are going to be close to reality 4 years from now. I actually think they'll probably be a lot worse. I think it'll be a little bit better. I think they're going to be worse. But so you're getting a rough picture, a rough painting of what we're going to see in the coming years. So I think they were just pulling the house together, and it was going to take a little bit of time. But I do agree, this is a big difference between them. And if you look at the total, outlays over the years to come, the NDP is actually looking to be the quote unquote more fiscally responsible of the two between the Liberals and the NDP, in part because they're raising more money, or at least not canceling the as many tax cuts as the Liberals would. And tax cuts are spending. Right? This is a critical point that we forget. And when the Conservative platform comes out tomorrow, if you're listening to this on Tuesday, it'd be today. If you're listening to it before, it's tomorrow. When that comes out, we're going to see a bunch of tax cuts. And the Tories will say, the Liberals and the NDP want to spend. Well, tax cuts are spending, because you got to pay for those. And you pay for them either by, raising taxes elsewhere, or by cutting when you're in a deficit. And so the NDP has a plan that I think ultimately is, in many ways, pretty sharp. With the one caveat is that they're saying that this wealth tax is going to raise $94.5 billion over whatever it is, 4 years, something like that. I don't entirely believe that that's true. I think the amount it's actually going to raise is probably significantly less. So I just remind people, whenever you're listening to these numbers, the parties are giving you the best case scenario for their particular context. So, revise everything downward a little bit to match reality.
Well, and especially with the revenue figures that are based on tariffs, right? Because we don't know what the tariffs are going to be in 3 years. If they're going to be higher, because we go tit for tat with the Americans, or they get lowered because we
or removed,
militarizing the border, like
or removed, right? And what this is why I wish we had longer debates and discussions where all the party leaders were sitting around. If you watch the French debate, Radio Canada's Patrice Roy says expressly to the parties, how are you going to pay for your tax cuts? We don't know, because we haven't seen your cost of platforms yet. I would like to see things like, all of you, one of you are going to be prime minister, you're going to have to renegotiate the USMCA deal with Donald Trump. You've baked in these assumptions on tariffs. What changes if the USMCA thing changes? What if you don't get a deal, or if you get a better deal than expected, or a worse deal than expected? What does that look like? And the parties will tell you privately that platforms are rough guideposts, in the same way that federal budget is a guide. But then reality often upsets that, because there's so many moving parts and uncertainties, right? And the Trump year is going to be that. And similar to the way that COVID was like that, the budget in 2019 obviously changed drastically by 2021 because of COVID. Ditto Trump. You can bake in a bunch of assumptions, but who knows? And this is a long-standing issue. Go back to the 1970s. The Liberal government creates the National Energy Program, which listeners in Alberta will be intimately familiar with. It's premised on the idea that was agreed to by econometricians and everyone at the time, that oil was going to keep going up and up and up and up, and then it didn't, and then the whole NEP falls apart. So who knows at the end of the day? But at least these documents will give you a sense of core values, right? And that's what I look for when I'm looking at these things. Like, what are the values that are being expressed in these numbers, rather than what are the particulars?
Right, and what are the priorities? And just one more question stemming from that is this distinction Carney's now making between operational spending and capital spending, and what you make of that, right? Because he's saying that, within 4 years, we're actually going to have an operational surplus, because we're going to cut, we're going to, the usual austerity talking points. We're going to trim waste. We're going to get rid of red tape. We're going to consolidate some programs, while at the same time, the broader deficit is going to increase, because he's promised to invest in a lot of capital projects, including some quite exciting ones like high-speed rail, though again, always read the fine print.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering what is Carney trying to do by sort of splitting the budget into operational and capital spending, which of course happens with every budget, but in terms of using it for discussions around debts and deficits.
I think it's a very liberal move because it's an attempt to have it both ways. To say, once we are prudent fiscal managers who are going to, quote unquote, catalyze private investment, this is his favorite thing to say, and through that catalyzing of private investment, raise revenues and invest in the infrastructure we need to drive the economy, to grow the economy. And I think that's true to a certain extent, that, well, obviously we need to invest in infrastructure. And as I was saying recently in a few places, was if you agree that we're in a crisis, which we are, and you agree that we need to diversify our trade away from the United States, both internally and externally, and we need to build the country to welcome more newcomers, or to welcome, actually liberals want fewer newcomers, but to welcome new people and to facilitate the people we have, you've got to build that infrastructure. You need rail, you need ports, you need transmission lines for electricity, you need a power grid. Everyone wants an east-west power grid. You need all of these things, and that costs a lot of money. You got to pay for that. Fine. But then you say, but we're going to run, a cleaner, balanced budget on the operational side. And that, so that's, we're going to spend good money over here, and that's good. And we're going to cut down on the bad money over here because that's bad. That's the operational spending, except for the parts of that which are good, incidentally, which is, healthcare and social transfers in general. And it lets them have this narrative of we can do both. And the critics say, no, money spent is money spent. But that's not true, right? It's very, very different to spend money on building infrastructure, which generates a return, than spending money on programs, which are important, but don't generate a return. The reason I don't like this characterization, though, is because at the end of the day, I actually do think it's all the same, but not for the reasons the Tories would say. I think it's all the same because it's all critical state spending that we need for people to be able to fulfill their capacity and to live a good life, right? Like the money you spend on the public service, the money you spend on CBC, the money you spend on health and social transfers, the money you spend on all the things that make state capacity possible is an investment, in the goal of the state. And so it looks like an accounting trick when you start to break it down between operational and capital. If the end of the day is, well, the goal is to have a state that fulfills its purpose, which is supporting those who live within it. And so it's a little bit irritating, but I think most people are going to look at it and say, oh, okay, he seems to know what he's talking about. He was the banker. And then I worry about the austerity risk of it too, especially if he does increase. Carney's argument is, I'm going to drop it from 9% growth to 2% growth over time. My understanding is that's not relative to inflation or to population growth. And if that's true, I could be wrong, but that was my reading of it, then that's a cut. And that's austerity, especially right now. So I'm a little bit nervous about all that. And incidentally, I'm also nervous about the infrastructure side if it ends up being a giveaway to public-private partnerships and big corporations that are going to go build these things and then run them like shit. So there's a lot of asterisks and caveats in there.
On Monday, Pierre Poilievre pledged to become the first prime minister to use the notwithstanding clause to override certain charter rights. He said that he would use this mechanism to implement his plan to mandate consecutive rather than concurrent life sentences for multiple murderers. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Poilievre's former boss, tried to do this when he was in power. But in 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that this constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Section 33 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms allows governments to override sections of the Charter dealing with fundamental freedoms, legal rights, and equality rights, but not democratic rights, for up to 5 years. The clause has been used most frequently by Quebec, but has also been used more recently by Ontario and Saskatchewan. Mark Carney and Jagmeet Singh have both said they won't use the notwithstanding clause. But Poilievre isn't the only party leader who's brought up this clause during the campaign. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet made a rare campaign appearance in Ottawa last week to defend the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause. The Coalition Avenir Quebec government preemptively invoked Section 33 for its secularism law prohibiting public sector employees from wearing religious symbols and legislation protecting the French language. Blanchet said one way to uphold this right would be to allow Quebec to select its own Supreme Court judges rather than the federal government. Now, a lot of hay has been made out of Poilievre's pledge to become the first prime minister to use it, whereas I think the Bloc's proposal, it's just like part of the course. But I'm wondering, since provincial governments routinely use Section 33 and increasingly so, as someone who lives in Ontario, is it that much of a stretch for the feds to start using it?
It's so this is such a complicated topic because the notwithstanding clause was included in the Constitution at the urging of the provinces in the 1980-81 negotiation around patriation. Pierre Trudeau hated it, and he called it a dead letter. It actually came from Alberta because it had been part of the Alberta Charter of Freedoms, and so Alberta sort of says, well, we've got this thing here. Have a look. And without it, there probably would have been certainly no charter and probably no patriation. So it's always been a part of it. And for a while, people said, oh, it's moribund because no one's really used it. And then it started getting used a little bit. Then it started getting used a lot. For a while, Quebec was routinely invoking it. And you mentioned Saskatchewan, who I think used it to union bust. And so, but, we kept saying, well, it exists. It is part of the Constitution, very plainly part of the Constitution. It is a legitimate legal tool, even if you think it's morally illegitimate or normatively undesirable, but it's there. But again, federally, it's not been touched because it is such an extraordinary thing, and no Liberal government was going to touch it because they are the party of the charter, they like to say, right? And that's, Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien were critical to that, and to use that would be to effectively betray two of their luminaries. Poilievre is an ideological fundamentalist, right-wing libertarian, Hayekian, who believes, though, that your liberties stop at the border of crime. And if you're going to break the social contract, such as it is on the right, then you got to really pay the price, and you got to pay it good and hard. And if it takes using Section 33, then that's perfectly legitimate. And so I think a lot of people worry because, one, it's a violation of the rights of those who've committed crimes, who, by the way, still have rights and ought to have rights. Is very important. And two, it opens the door to its use being normalized into other areas of life. And that starts making a lot of people, including those who are in or advocate for minority groups, very nervous, because the charter, first and foremost, and always applies against the state, so what the state can do to you, but often applies in the protection of minorities. So people get very, very nervous about that, and quite rightly. So I think that its use would be, at the federal level, would be very, very dangerous. I do think it risks normalizing it federally, and incidentally, empowering provinces to use it more often. And that's the other thing that makes me nervous, is that the feds start using it and it becomes a normal thing to do at the federal level. Maybe provinces say, well, you know what, we're going to use it even more. Or provinces who hadn't considered it before say, we're going to start using it because everyone else is using it. And if everyone else has this weapon and they're firing it, well, by God, we're going to fire it too. So I think this is actually quite a big risk, despite the fact that it is legitimate. It is a part of the Constitution, but just because you can use something doesn't mean you should. Part of the reason the premiers, or a handful of premiers, didn't want the charter without a notwithstanding clause is they worried, in good faith, that it would erode parliamentary supremacy. This idea that Parliament, at the end of the day, is the ultimate source of law and policy in this country through the people, as the people's representatives. And parliamentary supremacy is a big, important part of the Westminster system. And with a charter where you put down specific freedoms and rights that are then interpreted by judges who can then strike down laws if they're inconsistent with those freedoms and rights, you've eroded parliamentary supremacy and created judicial supremacy. And Section 33 rebalances that, because if the judges go too far or people don't like what the judges have done, then people can step up and say, okay, well, we've got Section 33 and we're going to use it to rebalance this. And you might be able to imagine on the left a situation in which maybe the left wanted to use the notwithstanding clause for something, because the judiciary had ruled on something that was inconsistent with left-wing values, and maybe there's something that the left wants to use it on, so that Parliament can trump the judiciary. I mean, in theory, you could. No example comes to mind immediately, but the takeaway being there that in theory, it's a useful tool to rebalance the battle between judicial and parliamentary supremacy. But in practice, I think once we start saying that minority rights and rights in general are up for debate like this, is the moment we start to lose them.
The Conservatives have made a lot of hay about Brookfield Asset Management's use of offshore tax havens when Mark Carney was in charge of the firm. On Monday, the Investigative Journalism Foundation reported that 7 Conservative MPs, including Deputy Leader Melissa Lantsman, have investments in Brookfield. Lantsman and her spouse both own stock in Brookfield Renewable Partners, which is based in Bermuda, where it doesn't have to pay corporate or capital gains taxes. Her spouse also owns shares of a Brookfield infrastructure fund that is also based in Bermuda. My former MP, Greg McLean of Calgary Centre, criticized Brookfield for underreporting its CO2 emissions. He specifically mentioned an Australia coal terminal, which is partially owned by Brookfield's infrastructure fund. Not only do Lantsman and her partner own shares in that infrastructure fund, but so does McLean. And while I'm often critical of allegations of hypocrisy being made when we're actually seeing politicians consistently enact their aristocratic worldview, I think this would be a pretty clear-cut case of hypocrisy. My question for you, David, is do you think voters care either way?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think they'll care to the extent that this becomes part of a narrative. So if you can bake in a tale of hypocrisy, it at least neutralizes the point a little bit. And said, well, yeah, okay, you think Carney was, out and unpatriotic because he was trying to minimize taxes paid so he could maximize investment returns, but you're doing the same thing effectively, or at least you're supporting the same thing by buying into this guy's company. Then people were like, oh, both sides, pox on both their houses, or conversely, good for both of them, right? And I think one of the things that irritates me about the Tory argument isn't even just the hypocrisy is obviously part of it by way of ownership, but also if this were a Tory, they'd be saying this is just good business, right? You're allowed to do tax planning and tax minimization. You're not allowed to do tax evasion. You're not allowed to do tax avoidance. And those are slightly different things, but they're both, one's, tax avoidance is against the spirit of the law. Tax evasion is more or less against the letter of the law, but you're not allowed to do either of them. You can do tax minimization though, tax planning. And unless you're on the other side of the aisle. But I think for a lot of voters, it's just not even going to register, especially in this election where it looks like the major narratives are entrenched and there's still some loose intentions. It's not everyone hasn't made up their mind, but 2 million people cast their ballot on the first advanced voting day, right? That's something like 7% of the voting population. So I ultimately don't think this will matter very, very much. Yeah, but it does remind a lot of people, and I think one of the takeaways from the left is this: the capital class is they're pulling for the Liberals or the Tories. That's they're different parties, I think it matters who wins, but it's not like you're going to get the revolution with one and not with the other. At the end of the day, they're all kind of Brookfield people, one way or the other.
Now, finally, I wanted to talk about something that isn't a development from the past week specifically, but has probably been the major policy issue in this election that isn't directly related to Canada-US relations. We're talking about housing, of course. Mark Carney promises to, in his words, unleash the power of public-private cooperation at a scale not seen in generations to build 500,000 homes a year. To do so, a re-elected Liberal government would establish an entity called Build Canada Homes, which would provide billions of dollars to accelerate the building of different types of housing across Canada. This includes a combination of grants and loans worth $4 billion for long-term fixed-rate financing for affordable homes. It also includes $6 billion for what's called deeply affordable housing, as well as housing targeted towards seniors, Indigenous people, and students. Carney doesn't define affordable housing, let alone deeply affordable housing. For the broader housing market, Carney has vowed to subsidize the cutting of municipal development permit charges in half for 5 years, which he claims would reduce the price of a 2-unit apartment in Toronto by $40,000. He's also pledged to bring back the multiple unit rental building cost allowance, which provides tax cuts on unrelated income for developers who build apartment buildings. As you noted in an April 1st Substack column, a lot of people seem to be reading things into Carney's housing platform that aren't necessarily there. I've seen some people call it more socialist than the NDP's housing policy, which, for all the NDP's flaws, I don't think is true. You wrote, there's a risk that BCH, or Build Canada Homes, acting as a developer, sets into the private-public partnership, P3, hell that results in poor quality, expensive, unaccountable outcomes. In essence, a giveaway to the private sector. You raised questions about who gets selected to build these homes through what process, whether they will be non-market, market, or mixed housing, and that the NDP should nonetheless embrace this opening, the fact that we're talking about giving the state some sort of role in housing. You wrote about that more than 3 weeks ago. Since then, the NDP has released more details of its housing plan, including the withholding of federal housing funds from provinces without rent control, and a ban on dem evictions, rent evictions, and fixed leases. And so I wanted to ask you, I think it's a very good piece. I'll certainly link to it in the show notes. But now that we've seen more of the NDP's housing platform, I wanted to ask, how do the Liberal and NDP approaches to housing stack up?
I still have a ton of questions around the Liberal housing plan. Who owns the land? They said that the federal government's going to be a developer. I'm like, okay, but you're selling the land to the builders, or are we going to do rental stock on the land? And if so, who's, yeah, yeah, but like, who owns the land if it's rental stock, and or because the details are thin on the BCH developer thing, and when I talked to a few people when the plan was first announced, they thought, well, this is a glorified loan program, and I still think it might be a glorified loan program. And I went through the Liberal platform and I word searched it, and I didn't see non-market in there. I could be wrong, but 2 looks and I didn't see it. The NDP talks expressly about non-market housing. And that I think is really, really important, is to say, no, we're going to straight up make sure we build non-market housing. And the NDP has got a similar idea, to use the state as a developer, although their plan is to partner with nonprofits, NGOs, or whomever, to get this stuff built too on federal lands and to acquire new federal lands to build on. Alongside the rental protection, and to build affordable and non-market homes, and on top of banning corporate entities, although not all corporate entities, but banning real estate investment trusts from buying up existing stock to financialize it and to sort of strip it like venture capital would. And so at the end of the day, I trust the NDP plan more, because they're expressly talking about non-market housing, and they're talking about partnering with not-for-profits who are going to do this work. And so in a sense, the difference between Build Canada Homes and the NDP plan at that level seems to be the NDP is going to kind of run an infrastructure, a housing bank, and the Liberals are going to do the same thing. That's at the top level. So they're both going to finance these buildings, but the NDP is talking non-market and partnering with communities, organizations to do it. Whereas the Liberals, I'm not sure who they're partnering with. At the end of the day, someone has to wield the hammer and hit the nails and operate the excavators. And that's going to be private, right? Like there's going to be private people involved in this. I'm sure the builders are going to be, they're not going to be state builders. But my questions are be like, okay, well, but who's getting the loans, and at what scale? And I just don't trust the Liberals as much as I do the NDP. Although I will say that most of the commentary I've seen on the MURB, the multi-unit residential building tax incentive thing, is that that is actually a good policy, in the sense that it will deliver a lot of multi-unit rental stock where we need it pretty fast. And then it worked in the 70s up until the point it was canceled in 1982. And I take an ecumenical approach to housing, where it takes all sorts. We need co-op housing, non-market housing, and a lot of it. I think we need the state to be a core part of financing and getting these things built. But you know what? The market is going to be a part of some of that too, certainly in the short term. And I think the NDP sort of recognizes this. And this gets to a deeper left-wing debate that we don't have to get into here. But the NDP could have gone all Maoist, no landlords whatsoever. But that's not happening overnight or anytime soon.
Well, there might be a leadership race.
That's true. We could get a Maoist. I think we won't, but we could. But one of the things,
entryism.
That's right. But one of the things that bothered me about the whole debate was, and I almost fell for this too early on when the BCH came out, was that the Liberals kind of had it both ways. On the left, they looked like this, they just outflanked the NDP on housing. But no, they were also going to be responsible about it. They were going to use the government, but in a responsible way. And where was the NDP on this? And the truth was, the NDP was kind of right there too. But the government the Liberals had branded this BCH thing and had fancy little graphics, and they called it a big wartime effort, going back to, back when we did post-World War II building, and they were going to do prefab building, which you could stand up really, really quickly, and all that sounded really, really good. But the NDP had a very, very similar plan, but that was more concerned about non-market. And they just didn't get the same kind of coverage or attention or framing or benefit of the doubt that the Liberals did. And I think that reflects a bit of a commentary bias and media bias that I almost fell for myself, so that I can't completely blame people for without pointing out my own limitations, because it took me a moment. My initial piece that I drafted, the one you read, was different. And when I first set it down, it was more critical of the NDP for not being where the Liberals were. And then I took a beat, talked to some people. And then when I go through my second pass, which I do, I changed it to reflect that fact. And I think a lot of people, though, didn't go through that process to update once they'd seen what the NDP was offering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you that the NDP's housing platform is better than the Liberals. I think it will get more people housed in units that are more affordable. But I have two reservations about it. The first being that, like the Liberals, they don't define non-market housing. Like, what is that? How much below market value, right? Because affordable housing, we know, is no more than 30% of income for like the lowest income quintile. And you never hear politicians talk about that when they say affordable housing or non-market housing. Like, yeah, non-market means below market value, but how much below market value? Is it $100 a month below market value? You know what I mean? And also, this isn't as much of a problem for the NDP as the other parties, because again, but this fixation on the number of units they want to get built, right?
Yeah.
That you see the Conservatives, I mean, that's all they're talking about, right? Because, again, Pierre Poilievre is a student of Milton Friedman. So it's just like supply and demand. You just let the market and work its magic and everyone will be able to afford homes. But at the same time, I've spoken to housing experts, in the recent past, saying that any housing plan that talks about numbers of units, that's a major red flag, because they're focused on quantity and not quality of housing, right? And so while I think the NDP is more descriptive of quality than the other parties, at least the two major parties, I am concerned that there is still some unknowns, fewer unknowns than the Liberal plan. But nonetheless, I wanted to ask you about this fixation in our mainstream discourse as reflected in the three major parties with different configurations of this fixation on quantity of housing.
I mean, I think the reason is simple. The CMHC or whomever will say we need X number of units a year to get to housing affordability. And governments work back from that probably, right? It was like, okay, well, if we need that many, what's Y? And then how do we get to Y? And that's easy for the public to digest. And I think it's similar to what we were talking about earlier with the costing, that who knows, right? I mean, we're projecting, what does immigration look like? Are we in a recession? What does that do? What's the specific balance between rental and ownership? What's the balance between non-market and market, affordable or deeply affordable? To go back to your point, and how do you define those things? And what about, are we doing rent geared to income or what? Like, what are the specifics? And the answer is always, we'll figure it out. And also other things like, the NDP, all parties say we're going to cut development charges. This is a big thing in the Liberals. I saw Mike Moffat point out the municipalities aren't going to bite because the cuts aren't steep enough to make it worthwhile. The NDP is going to withhold federal money if you don't get tenant protection measures. I'm like, are you going to fight with Alberta over, or whomever over rent control measures? And what does that do? It's going to take up all your time. All of this stuff is much, much messier when you dig into it. In fact, I think every promise from every party that talks about leveraging federal monies to get municipalities or provinces to get things done, it sidesteps the question of how the politics of that happens. Like, talk to me about how you actually do that when a city or a province says no, or when they all band together, which they do, and say no. Then what? Do you offer more generous terms? What does that cost? Do you provoke a national unity crisis over trying to force provinces to do something? Or do you just give them the money and walk away and say, you know what, no standards. We're going Quebec style on this. Figure it out yourself. Here's the money. What if one province thinks they're getting a worse deal than another, which they often do? The carbon tax was a good example of that. So it gets really, really messy really fast. But when you say, look, we're going to build 500,000 units, that's really clean. And politicians like clean. So it's our job to then say, what about the details? Which we're doing here. But for the parties, they're banking on the fact that people aren't going to take away the details. They're just going to take away the top line, which is often true.
On that note, thanks so much for joining me today, David. Let my listeners or viewers because we're on video now, know where they can find your work.
Coming to you live on Betamax. First of all, thank you for having me, and thanks for bearing with my multi-day cold as I struggle through the late days of the campaign. You can find me at www.davidmoscrop.com, which is where I host my Substack, and you can find me on YouTube, and you can find me in the National Observer and in Jacobin, and on the internet on Blue Sky and Twitter. And since it's the spring here in Ontario, and I'm now actually a homeowner, part of the problematic domineering class, you can also find me at the local hardware store, learning how to do all the things you're supposed to do as a homeowner.
Home hardware?
As a matter of fact, yes, which is just down the road from my house. I can, to paraphrase Sarah Palin, I can see home hardware from my house.
Well, homeowners helping homeowners.
That's right.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.